Well, joining me now is a great friend of the Spectator Australia and one of the most solid MPs in the federal parliament, the great Matt Canavan. Senator, how are you?
I'm great, Gideon. Thanks for having me on today.
Thank you so much for making the time up there in a busy sitting week to be here. Now, firstly, I think you have been vindicated this week on the Warragamba Dam. We've seen over the past few years the United Nations, among others, from thousands of kilometres away, stymie our infrastructure or argue against our infrastructure on the basis of dubious environmental concerns. What has this week shown us about what's at stake for not raising the Warragamba Dam?
Well, it's just such a shame, Gideon, that it takes an event like this for people to wake up. There have been moves to raise the wall of the Warragamba Dam for years. In fact, I remember organising a visit with Andrew Robb. I didn't get there in the end, but I was working at the time for Barnaby Joyce, and we were going around the countryside looking at dam sites where we could build dams. We identified over 100 sites that had just been sitting gathering cobwebs on the shelves of Department of State developments. You know, we haven't really built dams for decades in this country. And their Warragamba Dam was one, raising the wall there was one that was sitting on the books, being talked about for a long time. So it's one that we pushed and got behind. Now, since then, the New South Wales government has put it on their projects of state significance. They've got an environmental impact statement out, but that's been going since 2017. It just takes so long. And as you say, you've had all these green groups latch on and say how terrible a dam is. Just imagine if we didn't have the dam. Let's just take it in principle here, putting aside the specifics of the raising of the wall. Imagine if the dam hadn't been there at all. Imagine the devastation across Sydney right now if we just didn't have what was there. And if you believe the Greens and the UN and all their allies, they don't want any dams anywhere. Yeah. It's not a matter of arguing the toss about a particular project. It's just they don't want them at all. Now, clearly, dams can help a lot when it comes to flood mitigation. The Warragamba Dam, as it's currently built, is not really there for flood mitigation. That's not its purpose. But raising the wall, I think the New South Wales government wants to raise about 14 metres, would actually give it a flood mitigation purpose and would have at least had an impact. It's not going to get rid of the flooding completely, but it would at least help slow down these water releases, give people time to prepare, and limit the extent of the flooding as well.
This plan was argued against even though the capacity of the Warragamba Dam was at 100%. I mean, how could nobody see this coming?
Well, people do see it coming, but there's just an agenda. There's a closed-mind agenda from Greens and their allies. We should start from a basic principle, really, that whatever the UN tells us to do, you should basically do the opposite. I mean, the UN does serve one useful purpose. It's a bit like the George Costanza principle that if every instinct UN has is incorrect, the opposite of what they want to do must be correct. And that's just another example of proving and demonstrating that. Here, the UN pontificating about another country. I doubt many UN officials have ever gone out to see the site or talk to local people about what they want, but they've got a closed mind against any development, certainly against dams, and therefore they just say no. And unfortunately, they do convince some useful idiots in this place. It's one of the reasons why 4 years on from the New South Wales government starting up an environmental impact statement process, there's really been no developments. That's just sat there. They were meant to complete a business case by last year. Now we've had COVID and all these things, but there just doesn't seem to be enough progress. We've got to get on with it.
You are a former Minister for Northern Australia. I, in a past life, worked as a ministerial advisor for some reason in the policy area of Northern Australian development. And when I travelled through North Queensland and the NT and WA and everywhere else, the one thing that all these communities wanted every single time more than anything else, in some cases the only thing they wanted, was a dam. And for reasons I've never been able to understand, that nobody builds these dams. Nobody gives it to them. Why is that? What is standing in the way, other than the Greens and everything else? Why are we so slow off the mark with building dams?
Well, it's partly because of the green tape and regulation we've allowed to grow like a weed in this country over the past few decades. You or those, you're not in Sydney, Gideon, but those are lucky enough to live in Sydney do benefit from the Warragamba Dam being there. It provides their water day in, day out. But that was built in a different era when we didn't have this kind of regulation and red tape imposed on people who just want to build stuff. We do now. And so Northern Australia's had the unlucky coincidence to be trying to grow and develop at a period of time when our country has laid regulation upon regulation, making it very difficult to do the things you need to grow and develop. As I've said before, if only the Aborigines had realised that all they needed to do was implement an EPBC Act, and that would have, they wouldn't have anything to worry about with Captain Cook, right? If they'd had an Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act in place when Captain Cook arrived in Botany Bay, Sydney never would have been built. We never would have done these things. Just think next time you're walking down Tank Street in Sydney, there's a reason it's called Tank Street. Used to be a tank stream right underneath that street. It's completely covered up, completely gone. And there's no way it would have been approved. The building of Sydney would have been approved under an EPBC Act framework back in the 1800s. But they didn't have, they realised that the regulation legislation they needed to develop a new town, to attract people and build an economy, they needed to let that sort of stuff happen. We don't have the right regulatory framework for Northern Australia. We've got too much red tape, too much regulation for an area of the country we actually need to get things going to attract people to.
That's a really, really good point. The side effect of environmental regulation is stopping development. And you know what? I think that a lot of the time is the actual purpose behind it, not to protect the endangered skink or God knows what else. It is to stop progress, stop development. It's this anti-human agenda, and we are all suffering for it, not least of all North Queensland, which, as you said, is so prime for development, but is just being hamstrung by bureaucrats in Canberra and everywhere else. Now, I don't want to...
Well, can I just make one more point too? It said at estimates this week, and as I was going through these issues with the Department of Environment, I did make the accusation to them, they didn't have much of a rebuttal, that their approach right now is systemically racist. Right? Their approach is, they are saying up in the Cape at the moment, they're denying and not approving a proposal to grow 2,000 hectares of sorghum in Cape York, because the problem for the people of the Cape, where a lot of Indigenous people live, is that their environment's quite good. They hasn't been developed that much. And so what happens is when you go to develop something under the EPBC Act, you've got to offset it with other things. Now, they can't offset it much because their environment, their local habitat is already in a pretty good condition.
It's pristine.
There's not any improvement they can make. So what they're saying is that for someone who wants to do 2,000 hectares of sorghum, they have to lock up 20,000 hectares of country. They have to lock up a lot more country because the country is pretty good to start with. And maybe I said to the Department of Environment officials, they do need to book in for some unconscious bias training, because it seems to me that the impact of their policies are racist. They are denying Indigenous Australians development. When you can go down to clapped out country in Central Queensland, where I'm from, and you don't need to offset as much land because it's already been developed by white people.
And what happened then? Do they spit out their kombucha lattes, or how do they respond to accusations of systemic racism?
Kombucha latte, I don't know if that sounds very nice.
I don't think that's actually a thing.
I don't mind either of those things, I must say, Gideon, but together I'm not so sure. But look, they didn't have much of a response, Gideon. I think they're a little bit taken aback to be accused of being racist. I'm sure they don't consider themselves that. But they unfortunately, I think, fit that. There's that new Chinese word going around, which is fantastic. I don't think I can pronounce it properly, but Beizhu or something.
Yeah, Beizhu
means a white person who cares about issues that the Chinese don't think are that important, like environmentalism, LGBTO rights, all these things.
That's correct. But look, you were stunningly ignorant in making that allegation, to be perfectly honest. Everybody knows that the only people who are capable of being racist are conservatives and white men. But anyway, I digress.
True.
Now, I'm not going to demean you by making you talk in specifics about the circus and the sleaze and the muck and the garbage that we've seen coming out of Canberra this week, over a month, frankly. But I'll put it this way. We have spent the better part of the week talking about what a few drongos got up to in the prayer room of Parliament House, as disgusting and terrible and as inappropriate and unacceptable as it is. But meanwhile, we are approaching $1 trillion debt. We have the world's highest power prices. As you said, huge parts of the country with enormous potential being held back by green tape. Employment is still sluggish. Wages are barely keeping up with inflation. Now, the scandals that are besetting the Parliament are bad. But to me, the issues I've just outlined, which are the tip of the iceberg, are much worse. Do we have our priorities straight in the national debate?
The short answer is no, we don't. I do want to say the behaviour that's been exposed is absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah, of course.
And proves and shows a lack of discipline, really, among some people who work in this place. And I want to say it's only some people, as you'd know, Gideon. The vast majority of people here work hard. They take a lot of honour and make a lot of sacrifices to work in this fantastic and sacred building. But there has to be the re-establishment of standards, and has to be a strong message to us all that this cannot continue. I do think we miss someone like Peter Credlin. I sort of started here working under her, and she was really good at doing that and impressing the importance of good behaviour, good standards. As I say, discipline. It's a privilege to work in this place, and that needs to be reflected in the way we go about our business. Now, but you're right. As important as those things are, there perhaps hasn't been a more challenging time for our country. Maybe, I don't want to be too dramatic, but since World War II, we have the highest debt since World War II. We are facing a very aggressive, assertive and growing threat in China to our north that no one really knows where this will go. And we remain quite distracted at the moment, I think, with the daily news cycle, partly because we have been very lucky in the past few decades. It is hard, I suppose, for some to think that there's much wrong with Australia right now. It's a great place. We've had largely avoided recessions, notwithstanding the government imposed one in the pandemic last year, but we seem to be recovering from that relatively quickly. So in your daily life, when you go around this country, the sky looks blue. It's a great place to live, great place to bring up a family. There are jobs for those who want to work hard. House prices are going up. There's general positivity. But there are these storm clouds on the horizon. They're pretty threatening, looming storm clouds that the sooner we can focus on and tackle, the better position we'll be if that storm hits. It may not hit, maybe we'll get lucky again. But we really do need to quickly focus on the need to rebuild our industrial strength, get down our power prices so we're in a competitive position, continue to build up our defence and military capabilities. And I would say on the international agenda, focus on those things, not these distractions around how much emissions we're going to have in 2050. I mean, there's no point worrying about that if China invades Taiwan or some such, and we've got a completely different problem in the 30s and 40s. Yeah,
and we're worried about pronouns and how many windmills we can build to offset the destruction we've done to our energy sector. You make a great point, and this point has been made by others, which is that you're right, Peter Credlin. I worked in the Abbott government as well, and I saw what Peter Credlin was like as chief of staff to Tony Abbott, and she ran a very tight ship. I mean, she would never have let this go on. One sniff of something like this, and she would have had forensic teams combing the desks a la CSI to see who the perpetrators were.
She would have had you for breakfast, right? You would have been put the fear of God
absolutely
into us all.
And rightly so.
And look, I mean, perhaps I think that perhaps the problem's been Peter was criticised for perhaps being too authoritarian in that regard, and then when she left, it was almost a swing to the opposite, I think, and that's perhaps been the root cause of some of the issues we face today. So that has to be rectified.
You make the point, in the absence of somebody actually keeping a lid on the hundreds of people who work for a government at any given time, then this is exactly what you see. You see this kind of ill-discipline that drives the government completely off course. Now, last week you were in the news for suggesting that Australia may want to follow Europe's lead and temporarily rethink the AstraZeneca vaccine in light of blood clots and similar issues with it. Now, look, my view was always that the number of blood clot cases seemed to me to be statistically insignificant, and I wasn't personally concerned. But the reaction to people like you who, for just posing these questions, saying, no, you can't say that, you can't bring it up, shut up and just keep getting the jab, that to me is self-defeating. That will not engender trust in what is a new and experimental vaccine. It's counterproductive.
Well, I'll make a few points here. Number one, don't worry about me. Yes, as you say, many of the elites and commentators had a real problem with me just raising questions. But I tell you what, the reaction I've had from average people on the street and back home where I'm from in central Queensland, being full-throated support, the basic principle I've been trying to stick up for is that individuals should be able to have the choice of deciding on their own medical treatment. We've trashed a lot of freedoms in the past year, Gideon, as you know, but I don't think we want the state telling people or making people take certain needles or medical treatment. That should be left to the individual. And this comes to my point about the pausing. I thought we missed an opportunity to pause, to pause, because I get, that what the point you were making statistically, it seemed like, okay, there's not that many cases, but there are a lot of skeptical people out there about getting the vaccine. And if we had a pause, even if it was just for a few days while we waited for the European Medicines Authority to conclude its studies, that would have helped build confidence among the community, I'd say, because the regulators could then say, well, look, even if there's even a hint, even a scintilla of concern and safety, we will take the drastic action and pause the rollout. You can trust us. But look, that's gone now, and I accept, as the studies have proven, that is a statistically low chance. But this is a final point I want to make. Just because it's a very small statistical probability for the population overall that you could get one of these severe blood clot reactions, that doesn't mean that there aren't individuals with certain medical issues where it's a bigger risk. Yeah. And that seems to be coming out in the European studies, which I'm now following closely, that there are some in our community, especially young women, who have certain propensities that give rise to clotting events or bleeding events, and they could have a higher risk in this case. But I think it's very important, again, that we give, going back to where I started, that those people have the choice about how they are treated, that they are given the space and without undue social pressure to consult their own doctors. I'm not providing any medical advice here. Go and see your doctor and talk about that. And also, I think, finally, anyone that's in a vulnerable situation like that, or potentially vulnerable, should be able to have the choice of vaccine. We've got a situation at the moment in the country where you're being told this is the vaccine you're getting. Yeah. And I'm not sure why there can't be just a little bit more flexibility in those cases. I get, given the rollout, we might not be able to give choice to everybody, but they're just such a rigid approach at the moment. And I've raised this with the Department of Health, but right now, you've got one choice, lump it or leave it. Yeah,
and that's part of the problem, I guess. There's no capacity to shop around, to do your research, to look into things, to choose the vaccine that's right for you. You're right, it's this we're not even encouraged to do our own research. It's just we need to take our advice.
Well, doctors are gagged too. There's another point I forgot that I don't know if you've seen, but the regulatory authorities for doctors has issued statements effectively gagging GPs. They have been told in quite passive-aggressive language that if they do anything to undermine the vaccine rollout, they could lose their registration. And I've been inundated since I made my calls public, I've been inundated by correspondence from GPs raising this as a big concern for them. And none of these doctors are anti-vaccination. They just have the sort of concerns I've outlined here today and unable to tell them publicly.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I trust my local GP more than I trust idiots like Brett Sutton any day of the week. But I think the other thing to note is that...
can I just pick up? I wouldn't say Brett's an idiot, right? Yeah. The problem here is Brett is focused on one thing. Yeah. Right? Brett's focused on the coronavirus. And he's probably pretty good at that. You'd know him better than me. I'm not from Victoria. But this is the problem. I think when we focus on one thing in life, one risk, one problem, you forget about all the other risks and problems that there are as well. And that's a little bit my concern with the health industry at the moment. They're just so focused on the coronavirus. But what about mental health? What about keeping kids in school? What about, as I say, people with quite rare but still potentially drastic propensities to be at risk in this vaccine rollout?
The rates of vaccination in Australia are quite low, and the media commentary has tended to focus on the rollout and the bureaucratic element of it. Now, like any libertarian worth their salt, I am chomping at the bit to blame government for just about anything. But I think what the slowness of the vaccination rate in Australia tells us is that the take-up rate is actually low. People aren't rushing out to get it. And I think that comes back to government because of the narrative, which is, oh, no, this is safe. We know it's safe. Don't ask any questions. Just get it. The TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, says it's safe. So, go on and get it. Oh, really? The Therapeutic Goods Administration, the same Therapeutic Goods Administration that is trying to deny smokers a product that is 95% safer than regular cigarettes, that brain's trust of a TGA. And that segues very nicely into my final question, which is something that's very, very dear to my heart, which is vaping. You have been outstanding on the vaping issue, as have many of your colleagues within the coalition, despite the health minister's apparent vendetta against it. Where does the vaping debate stand, and will we ever get it legalised in any real way in Australia?
Well, we've got more work to do, that's for sure. I want to thank all those people who have helped me and others in this place push along the issue over the past year. I do think we've made progress, but there's a lot more to do. I do want to just pick up on that comparison to the vaccine rollout. The arguments that I butted up against last week was that well, we should, yes, there are some risks here with these clotting events, but we should continue on even in uncertainty because the benefits outweigh the risks. And how does that work with regard to the approach the TGA takes with e-cigarettes?
Yeah.
Where they say, because we haven't had a 30 or 40-year history of the use of e-cigarettes, there are still some risks they could do something, which no one's been able to detect yet. So let's stop them. When we know that they would, if we allowed them, they would improve so many people's lives.
Yeah.
So that the ethical framework or decision-making framework is totally skewed or biased in this case compared to how they're approaching vaccines. In terms of what we do next, you might have seen that the government does plan to continue later this year to require prescriptions for the purchase of liquid nicotine at pharmacies. In some senses, that's some liberalisation. It's not available for sale legally anywhere in Australia, although I'm sure there are illegal options, which I wouldn't encourage people, but that's what happens when governments do this sort of thing. And then there is going to be a rule around the importation of liquid nicotine. It's yet to be seen how much that will be enforced. Again, it's kind of illegal today to do this, but as you would know, many people are doing it. I plan to later this year to coincide with those moves to introduce a bill to the Australian Senate to legalise vaping. To look to something similar to the New Zealand model that has been established in the last couple of years. And hopefully that will just keep this discussion going, keep it live, and it will be there on the table even when there are any issues with the government's approach later this year. I just don't want to see, particularly while we're still recovering from a pandemic, people being denied something that does help them. As I've always say, I wouldn't encourage you to go out and vape. Nicotine's not a health product for you. But for those on cigarettes or addicted to these things, a lot of people seem to only succeed when they take up vaping. And it would be an absolute tragedy if the consequence of what the government's doing, more people went back to a much, much worse habit in smoking compared to vaping e-cigarettes.
Yeah, especially when we've just had a very, very nasty respiratory infection go around the world and you're encouraging people back on cigarettes. Riddle me that. Just to clarify, so the government intends to still, I knew about the pharmacy garbage and everything else, which is just crazy to me because you can go down to 7-Eleven and buy a packet of cigarettes, but you need to go to a doctor and get a script for something that's 95% safer. But I thought that the importation ban was being scrapped. So you're saying there'll still be an importation ban? Currently, you can only import, or are meant to only be able to import with a prescription. Right. That is the rule. Although I've never done this myself, but from what I hear, it's not particularly rigorously enforced, and a lot of people are importing liquid nicotine potentially without a prescription. So the government's not planning to change that. And I still haven't seen the details exactly what they will be doing in terms of increasing any enforcement of that rule. Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Senator Canavan. Keep up the great work. Keep up the fight for freedom within the circus that is our national parliament. And when are you next writing something for the Spec? Well, that's a good point. I was thinking of doing something on the vaccine issue, which you've just reminded me I'll have to do. So I have written something for my local paper. And I'll try and have a bit more fun in the Spectator. So I'll try and bash that into something soon. Excellent. Looking forward to it. Well, thanks, Matt. Have a great rest of the sitting week. You too, Gidgen. Have a good time, mate. Thanks. Cheers, mate.